What are the actual consequences if the deficit gets out of control?
The U.S. spends way more than it brings in and then borrows to cover that deficit.
Adding value in the economy is funded by this money creation.
The reality of how money is created differs from the description found in some economics textbooks.
What the bank is doing is very different from what it presents to the public.
This fallacy is the basis of austerity policy. So why is it that economics textbooks are teaching fallacies? What's going on? Bad economic theory led to bad economic policy. Well, I'm Professor Steve Keen, and in this video I'm going to explain to you why a responsible government must run deficits. Now, obviously, that's the opposite of what conventional wisdom teaches. And conventional wisdom tells us that a responsible government runs a balanced budget, or even preferably a surplus. And government debt should be kept as low as possible, and private debt, not government debt, is the dangerous form of debt. Conventional economic thought, which is called neoclassical economics, is what gave us neoliberal politics in the first place. And that's dominated economic policy really since the 1970s. And it promised a utopia, but what it's delivered is a dystopia. And the foundations of both neoliberalism and the austerity policies that have come with it is a false model of banking. And this false model is derived from the favorite tool of mainstream economists, the supply and demand diagram. Now, most politicians think in those terms, whether they're conscious of it or not. And the reason is they've done a course in PPEs, they call it in the UK, or Econ 101 in America, and it teaches them to think with this structure in mind all the time, intersecting supply and demand diagrams. When you model money using that conventional tool, you end up with fallacies. Realistic economics uses double entry bookkeeping. Instead, this sort of structure, throw away the supply and demand diagrams. And why is that? Because banks don't use supply and demand diagrams to decide how much money to lend. They use double entry bookkeeping. This is how the world actually works. Accounting is the foundation of our monetary economy. You keep track of your assets, your liabilities, and your equity, or you're going to go bust at some point. So if you don't understand accounting, you really don't understand money. And mainstream economists, because they don't do the accounting, get money completely wrong. And by the way, if you want to use my proprietary software Ravel for economic analysis too, you get it as a free bonus inside my 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge, like over 600 people have already done. To learn more, apply at stevekeen.com. So to understand money, you have to think in terms of double entry bookkeeping. And the basic idea there is that your financial assets are your claims on other people. Your financial liabilities are other people's claims on you. So when you look at a transaction with your bank account, for example, the bank account is your asset and the bank's liability. The fundamental rule for accounting is that assets minus liabilities equals equity, and that rule transforms what we can understand about money from what we get taught in terms of supply and demand thinking, because supply and demand analysis leads economists to make fundamental accounting errors. And these errors about money are why neoliberalism has failed in practice. Now, mainstream economists and the politicians who they influenced believed that fiscal responsibility was going to bring about prosperity. And this is Ronald Reagan telling us this when he was president some 40-something years ago.
I hope history says of us that we were worthy of our past, worthy of our heritage. We can seize the moment. We can do our best for America to keep our future strong, secure, and free. Our children will thank us, and that's all the thanks we'll ever need.
President Ronald Reagan firmly believed that we, as Americans, must work together to restore fiscal responsibility and strengthen America, ensuring that future generations inherit a nation of opportunity, security, and enduring prosperity.
Well, that's not what we got. And the reason is that these policies actually failed in execution. They did the opposite of improving the rate of economic growth and lifting economic prosperity. They actually reduced it. So if you take a look at the average rate of per capita economic growth in the United States before Reagan came to power, it was roughly 2.5% per annum. After Reagan, it's been 1.7% per annum. That's a 0.8% difference, a fall in the rate of per capita economic growth, not an increase. Similarly, when you look in the UK, before Maggie Thatcher came to power, the average rate of per capita growth in the UK was 2.4% per annum. After her, it became 1.75% roughly. That's a 0.7% gap between what occurred before Reagan and Thatcher took over and what occurred after. And because of that, over the time that's elapsed, the level of per capita income now is 40% lower than it would have been if we'd continued with the rate of growth that those pre-neoliberal policies actually gave us. So I'm sorry, Ronnie, you've children aren't going to say thank you. They're going to say thanks but no thanks, because what you thought would make things better actually made things worse. So what went wrong? Fundamentally, bad economic theory led to bad economic policy. Now, economics textbooks teach that banks lend out what households deposit. They call them intermediaries. But in 2014, the Bank of England came out and supported heretics like me who said this is false. And what they said was that banks do not operate as intermediaries. They don't lend out what deposits are made by savers to borrowers. Instead, it said textbooks are wrong. The reality of how money is created differs from the description found in some economics textbooks, which means basically 99% of them. And what the bank said instead is, rather than banks receiving deposits from households and lending them out, bank lending creates deposits. That's the paper where the argument was made, and this is one of the authors explaining it.
In the modern economy, where does money come from?
Now, while this is nothing new, it is sometimes overlooked as the main way in which money is created. And it runs contrary to the view sometimes put forward that banks can only lend out deposits that they already have. In fact, loans create deposits, not the other way around.
Now, this is huge. This is as big as saying this Earth is not the centre of the universe, the sun is. It's just as radical a change in economics as it should be from the pre-Copernican vision to the post-Copernican vision. But economics textbooks have ignored the Bank of England, and they still teach that households are the lenders, not banks. This fallacy is the basis of austerity policy. Why are they doing this? Why do economists teach these ideas? Now, textbooks teach that deficits reduce the supply of money and crowd out private investment. And that's the reason that politicians, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, believe that the government should balance its books. As impressionable youths, they learnt these fallacies and they trusted their teachers. And this is the sort of argument that they were given when they were 17 years old or thereabouts.
The amount of money a bank can lend out depends on how much money people deposit into that bank. The supply of loanable funds is made up of private savings. That's savings by you and me, but there's also public savings. That's the money that the government has left over after paying for all its expenses. So the supply curve is made up of both private savings and public savings. There's all this money to be loaned out, but the government comes in and starts to borrow it, so there's less money left over, and so the supply of loanable funds shifts to the left and the real interest rate goes up. This is the idea that government deficit spending designed to help the economy actually ends up hurting the economy because it increases real interest rates and decreases investment and growth.
All those arguments are fallacies. The assertion that government borrowing causes crowding out, that deficit spending decreases investment and growth, are the exact opposite of the truth. In reality, deficits actually create money for the private sector, and they encourage private sector investment. So why is it that economics textbooks are teaching fallacies? What's going on? Mainstream economics is a delusional, anti-government, anti-worker ideology, and it blames the problems which are caused by the financial sector on unions and on the government itself. So here's a textbook saying that what causes unemployment is unions demanding too high a wage level, which causes unemployment, not the financial sector causing bubbles and booms and crashes. It ignores inequality because this is a leading mainstream economist assuming that it doesn't matter who earns money because they'll spend the money on exactly the same thing. You have to look below the supply and demand diagram, superficial analysis to see it. And it is possible to have an alternative approach to economics. This is one of my most recent books where I explain for the general audience what an alternative economics can look like. Of all the fallacies in mainstream economics, probably the most damaging are these fallacies about how banks operate and also how the government finances itself. So when you look at the arguments made by textbook economists in terms of supply and demand diagrams, but put it in double entry bookkeeping, you can see where the fallacies come from. So PPE in Economics 101 teaches that banks are just intermediaries who enable savers to lend to borrowers, but don't actually do any lending themselves. The bank accounts of the private sector are liabilities of the banking sector. So what you have, savers bank at the banks and borrowers bank at the banks, and if the saver lends £10 to the borrower, then the saver's account falls by £10, the borrower's account goes up by £10. There's no change in total deposits. There's still £100 in this model, so no money is created. Bank lending creates deposits. So what does that look like in double entry bookkeeping terms? Well, now the loan turns up because the loan is actually an asset of the bank. If the bank lends the borrower £10, then loans go up by £10. Deposits also go by £10. £110 of deposits now exist, so £10 of additional money has been created. And at the same time, bank-owned money, and at the same time, bank-owned debt of the same magnitude is also created. So that's the real world. Now, mainstream economists say, oh, there's nothing wrong with teaching a false model. And why is that? They establish a benchmark result for comparing the loanable funds approach to money creation allocation, and they say that both processes yield the same allocations, in other words, the same goods are purchased, when there is no uncertainty. And they then say, in such cases, using the simpler model does not imply any loss of generality. Go below the surface appearance. This is the nonsense that supports this entire edifice. So mainstream neoclassical economics is delusional, and the difference is not about allocations, but about the creation of money. And the real world is always uncertain. Banks and money and debt always matter. You must include them in your modelling to know what's actually going on. Now, I've developed a piece of software I call Ravel. So if you start from the model that the textbooks teach, where banks are simply intermediaries, then the lending is between one bank deposit account and another bank deposit account. In this case, I've got the savers lending to the borrowers. So credit dollars per year is lent from savers to borrowers. You can increase the level of credit. Nothing happens to GDP because no money is being created. Positive credit, negative credit, nothing makes any difference at all. In this world, credit doesn't matter. But the real world is that it's not the savers who are lending, it's the banks. So I delete debt as an asset of the savers. I can then go and show that it's an asset of the banks instead. That's the only change I make. And then I run the model again and see what happens when credit goes positive. You get rising GDP. If credit slows down, the rate of growth of GDP also slows down. If credit goes negative, GDP falls. So textbooks are completely wrong about private debt in this particular case. And the real world is what I call not loanable funds, but bombed, bank-originated money and debt. So bank lending actually drives GDP. And mainstream economists are completely wrong about the private sector. They're equally wrong about government debt. Now, it's more complicated to show government debt in this model. But what I've got here is the textbook argument that households lend to the government. Now, first of all, when the government spends, it reduces what's in its bank account, running a deficit, and that turns up in household accounts. That's the positive. But it's then required to issue bonds. And in the textbook version, the bonds are sold to the household sector. That reduces the amount of money that the households have available to lend to firms. That crowds out investment, so you're going to have a fall in money available for lending and a fall in GDP. But in the real world, it's the banks that do the lending. Households are basically irrelevant in this case. The deficit does increase the amount of money in household accounts, but the bond sales don't involve the households at all. What are called primary auctions occur between the government and the banking sector, and what are called primary dealers as well. The deficit itself actually creates money. The amount of money in household accounts rises if the government spends more on households and firms than it takes back from them in taxation. So the deficit creates money. It doesn't take money away. And secondly, interest payments also create money. Of course, the money is created for those who own the bonds. Now, the primary bond sales in the real world don't affect the money supply at all. They don't borrow money. What they do is they change the asset that backs that money from reserves to bonds that the banks then hold. So the deficit, by increasing the amount of money in existence, can actually crowd in private investment because there's more cash flow, and therefore firms have more ability to invest from retained earnings than they would have if the government was running a surplus or a balanced budget. Mainstream economists predict there's going to be a catastrophe, and in their model, they're right. Let's take a look at it. So here's the model that they believe, that the government borrows from the private sector directly. And everything is fine if the government doesn't run a deficit, but as soon as it starts to run even a 1% of GDP deficit, there's an explosion in the ratio of government debt to GDP. Interest payments go through the roof. If I run this for 100 years, you get government debt reaching 2,000% of GDP. Obviously, this is a totally unsustainable system, but it's not the real world. All I have to do to make it into the real world is, first of all, delete the fiction that the bonds are sold to the private household sector. In fact, the first buyers of bonds are the banks themselves, so the bond sales occur there. Then I delete bond sales from down here and delete interest being paid to the households. In fact, it's paid to the banks. And it's not true that the government banks at private banks, it banks at the central bank. So I now show the government account as a liability of the central bank. That brings across all those operations. So bonds are purchased by transfer of funds from reserves to the government. The deficit transfers funds from the government to the reserves, and so do interest payments. And of course, the interest payments in this model don't go to the household sector, they go to the bank. So I've got to type that in up here. And then I now flip a little switch to show the interest is all spent and hit the run key. And nothing again happens without a deficit. When a deficit happens, the amount of money increases. The deficit actually creates money. That also causes a higher level of GDP, and that means the level of government debt rises, so does GDP. So the ratio of one to the other doesn't go infinite, it stabilises, and in this model with the parameters I've used, it stabilises at 100% of GDP. If I doubled the velocity of money, that would halve the level of government debt as a percentage of GDP. So in the real world, deficits create fiat money, and that finances both public services and economic growth in general. The debt stabilises relative to GDP. There is no government debt crisis. This is all a myth, and our economic policies are being dominated by a myth. So mainstream economists and the politicians they've convinced, unfortunately, have everything backwards. First of all, private debt, not government debt, is the dangerous one. When you take a look at the level of private debt in most countries, it's far higher than government debt, and its ups and downs cause booms and crashes. So credit, not deficits, causes the cycles, including extreme events like the global financial crisis. When you take a look at credit, which is the annual change in private debt, and compare it to the unemployment rate, they're almost the opposites of each other. Rising credit reduces unemployment, falling credit increases unemployment. Now, deficits, on the other hand, are driven by the crisis. So rather than causing a crisis, deficits reduce the impact of that crisis by creating money that wouldn't otherwise exist during a downturn. And this is a global phenomenon. I just showed the United States there. This is the UK and Spain. And in both cases, the same story applies. Private debt is far higher than government debt in both countries. The ups and downs of private debt are what cause booms and slumps, not the deficits. And the deficits come in after the event and reduce the damage done by a private sector debt crisis. But they're part of the way of avoiding things like debt deflations. So mainstream economic theory is just simply not fit for purpose. It makes politicians focus on the wrong factors, and it ignores the real causes of economic crises. And this is something which permeates the political system. All the various political parties around the world, they believe that deficits reduce the supply of money and crowd out private investment. In reality, deficits increase the supply of money and they can encourage private investment. So the government should run deficits for multiple reasons. First of all, to create fiat money. Secondly, to finance building and maintaining the things the private sector will not do, and that's things like public health, public education, long-lasting infrastructure. And the money that they create by running a deficit enables the private sector to save. Now, the key error in the way the mainstream thinks about banking and savings, the sum of private and government savings is zero. The private sector can only save in the aggregate if the public sector dissaves. And rather than having a supply and demand diagram in your head, what you should have is a seesaw. Now remember that one entity's financial asset is another entity's financial liability. Therefore, the sum of all financial assets and liabilities is zero. And that's just like a seesaw. For one side of a seesaw to be up, the other side has to be down. So forget about supply and demand curves. Put this meme into your heads. There's a seesaw which is balanced. Now, we might think we'd like to be in that situation, but there's a catch in the financial system, and that is that banks must be in positive equity or they're bankrupt. This is the definition of bankruptcy for a bank, is having short-term liabilities that exceed their short-term assets. So banks must be up here for the system to work, and that means non-banks must be at the bottom level. And that non-bank includes not just the government, but also the non-bank private sector. The only way that the non-bank private sector, and that's basically firms and households, can also be in positive financial equity as if the government's in identical negative financial equity. So this is the situation that enables households and firms and banks to all be in positive financial equity. The government is down here, therefore non-government is up there, and so that includes both banks and the non-bank private sector. If you have a government, on the other hand, that follows what neoclassical economists teach them and tries to be neutral, then banks have to be in the positive. The government decides to be sitting on the middle of the seesaw. That means households and firms have to be down the negative end. Now, the only way that firms and households can be in positive financial equity, so to have short-term assets that exceed their short-term liabilities, the only way that can happen is if the government is in negative financial equity. So the government has to swap places. And then you're going to have a private sector where both banks and firms and households are all in positive financial equity. So government surpluses, rather than being saving by the government actually drive the private sector into negative financial equity. And that normally leads the private sector to look at its balance sheet and say, oh, I need to make some capital gains here. I might go borrow money from a bank and buy houses or shares. It leads to speculation. All these attempts by the government, and this goes back 2 centuries, to try to get itself into positive financial equity leads to the private sector gambling with borrowed money on the prices of non-financial assets, things like shares and houses, and that leads to a financial boom and bust. This is data from America going back to 1900, and you can see that there's only a couple of periods where there's been a sustained surplus, one here and one here. That is under Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s, and he raved about how wonderful his surpluses were. It's no coincidence that after he reduced government debt from 30% of GDP to 15% by running surpluses of 1% of GDP per year, the Great Depression happened. The boom of the 1920s gave way to the crisis of the Great Depression. Clinton raved about his surpluses. That led to the global financial crisis. The government trying to be responsible according to conventional wisdom actually causes crises. So no one likes being in negative financial equity, but the government must go into negative financial equity to enable the non-bank private sector, households and firms, to be in positive financial equity. That's worth a fortune, and that lets the government operate with negative financial equity. And it's okay, and in fact it's even necessary for the government to have net financial liabilities, because to some extent a country is defined by where its government's liabilities are accepted as money. So to actually mark out your country, you have to have a deficit. Your public financial situation has to be negative financial equity that enables the private sector to have positive financial equity, and that enables a capitalist economy to work well rather than as badly as we've seen for the last 40 years. So we need sensible monetary and fiscal policies, not diluted economic theory. The inability of mainstream economists to understand money creation is the basis of the bad economic advice that they give. Now, one of the many things you'll hear about the dangers of government debt is, what about bond vigilantes? Won't the government be unable to sell its bonds if its debt ratio is too high? Not in the primary auctions where the bonds are first sold, and they're called gilt auctions in the United Kingdom. What happens in those auctions is the government sells treasury bonds, and those treasury bonds let the banks and primary dealers, they can swap reserves, which never used to earn interest until after the global financial crisis, and you can't trade reserves, for bonds which earned a higher rate of interest than reserves and are tradable. Now, how often do these auctions occur? There's about 100 gilt auctions per year in the UK and about 300 primary auctions per year in the United States. Government deficits are normally under 10% of GDP. Let's just use that as a maximum average. So on average, less than 0.1% of GDP worth of bonds is sold at each auction. Now, after the global financial crisis, when reserves expanded dramatically under quantitative easing, UK reserves now exceed 30% of GDP. In the United States, they're about 10% of GDP. That is 300 times the amount of funds that are necessary to buy all the bonds that are offered at any individual auction. So primary auctions and gilt auctions will always be oversubscribed. And the crisis that Liz Truss went through, which people saw as a case of the bond vigilantes, was actually a side effect of the Bank of England and all other central banks run by neoclassical economists increasing interest rates, believing that would reduce the rate of inflation. What it did do was reduce the value of existing bonds. Any long-term bonds owned by pension funds and so on were massively reduced in value by the increase in interest rates from about 1% in about 90. The bonds that were owned by private sector entities like pension funds and so on were massively devalued by interest rates rising from 1% or so, which was the level they lingered at after the global financial crisis, to 5% during the COVID inflation. And that increasing interest rates to try to reduce inflation almost bankrupted the banking sector. So that's what mainstream economists cause without even being aware they were going to cause that problem. Now, also, you get the arguments interest payments are going to cripple the economy. We're going to spend all the deficit paying interest, and ultimately there'll be nothing left for anything else. Wrong. The way the government pays interest is the same way it runs a deficit. It creates the money. Now, it can create too much money for the financial sector, and it's certainly doing that right now. But a government cannot go bankrupt in its own currency. And the government is not like a household. This is the analogy you'll hear all the time. Yes, a household can go bankrupt. In that situation, if you had too much debt and you were facing bankruptcy, could your spouse buy all your debt and therefore mean you don't have to pay interest on it anymore? No? Okay. Well, the government can. The central bank could buy all Treasury bonds overnight and therefore save the Treasury from paying interest. All they've got to do is buy them off the banks and buy them off the non-banks. And what happens at the central bank is you credit the bonds that are owned by the central bank rise, the reserves that the banks have at the central bank also rise. Everything works out nicely, and the Treasury either doesn't pay interest to bonds that are owned by the central bank, or the central bank gets paid the interest and then it remits the interest back to the Treasury later. Now, this is why Japan, which is currently running a government debt level of 250% of GDP, can do so with ease, also because it has a trade surplus. It can handle it. It can buy all the outstanding debt. That's what the Bank of Japan has been doing. Now, who would complain if the Bank of England did what I suggest here and bought all outstanding treasuries overnight? The loudest complaints would come from the private banks and the merchant banks, because they need treasuries to play the bond market. And if we got rid of it, they'd be the ones to complain. If we got rid of the deficit, they'd be the first ones to complain. So we don't need their money, they need ours. Now we get the inflation argument. Didn't Milton Friedman prove that government money printing causes inflation? Well, yes, he did, by making the craziest set of assumptions you've ever seen. This is from his paper where he introduced the idea of helicopter money. So he assumed a stationary society, no growth, constant population, given tastes, fixed resources, given state of technology, capital goods that don't wear out and can't be bought or sold or manufactured. Lending and borrowing is prohibited. He didn't even rule out exchange of goods, it was only exchange of services. Money is just little pieces of paper, and you've been in equilibrium for a century in this situation, and then a helicopter flies over the top and drops another $1,000 notes out the windows. Well, yes, government money creation causes inflation in that situation because there's nothing left that can. He's left out all the stuff that changes. Now, on the real world, we have changing society, changing population, changing tastes. Capital goods do depreciate. They can be reproduced. They do require maintenance. Lending and borrowing is endemic to the system. Money is both fiat and credit. The economy is always in disequilibrium, and in the real world, money doesn't control inflation, it accommodates inflation. One way to see this is look at your own credit card. If you have credit that you haven't yet accessed on that card, then you can go out and buy something tomorrow, and you actually create money when you do that. Now, in America, the total level of unused credit card balances is equivalent to $5 trillion, about 17% of the total money supply in America. So causation goes from inflation to the money supply. More often that goes the other way around. If things are more expensive, you swipe your card and pay the higher price. The money supply rises because prices have risen. So the primary causes of inflation are not government money printing, but conflict over the distribution of income. Workers want higher money wages. Corporations put higher markups on money wages. Technological progress reduces the rate of inflation. Energy costs increase the rate of inflation. Those are the things you need to address, not government money creation. And when you look at money creation in the United States, over 90% of the money that's been created between 2000 and 2024 was actually created not by the government, but by the private sector. So this is the percentage of the increase in 2000 and 2024 due to private sector money creation, not government money creation. And back in the halcyon days of Maggie and Ronald, government money was actually destroyed. 144% of the money created between 1980 and 2000 was by the private sector. So government policy actually destroyed fiat money in the 1980 to 2000 period. Now, in that situation, how can you blame government money printing for causing inflation when during the operative period for high inflation, government money creation was actually negative? If you really want to know what's going on about inflation, those are the two experts, Isabella Weber and Blair Fix. So it isn't just since Maggie and Ronald that we've been dominated by this belief that the deficit is a bad idea. It's really been something which is conventional thinking right back to the 1800s. But if you look at the data, government deficits are the norm. This is the United States data going right back to 1900. You can see that government spending used to be extremely small, about 3% of GDP. It's now about 20% of GDP. But across that whole period, most of the time spending has drastically exceeded taxation income. The average surplus for America has been a deficit of 2.8% of GDP. And if you leave out World War I and World War II, you still get a deficit of 2.6% of GDP. So the standard situation is to run a deficit. Now, China hasn't been afflicted by neoclassical thought as yet, and when you take a look at what they've been doing, their average deficit is not 2.5% 5% of GDP, but 5.5% of GDP. They've had enormous fiscal stimulus from government money creation. And if you take a look at the aggregate creation of money in a capitalist economy, government deficits create fiat-backed money, private sector credit creates debt-backed money, and trade surpluses transfer some money creation from the importing nation to the exporting nation. Now, China's used all of those factors very wisely, and it's harnessed them for public and private investment. And of course, there's been some real estate speculation as well. Whereas the Anglo nations of the European Union have all listened to economists, they've restricted government deficits, they've used credit for real estate speculation because that's what consenting adults do in private, and they've run trade deficits. Not all of them, of course, but some of those countries. China's ignored the economists and done what they think is impossible, and the results are spectacular. It's quite remarkable when you see the data. Over the last 30 years, the average rate of increase in per capita incomes in China has been 8.5%. In the United States and the UK, it's about 1.5%. Now, what does that mean in terms of how long it'll take to double per capita income? Well, in the United States and the UK, it'll take 45 years, roughly, for per capita income levels to double if that rate of growth is kept up. China doubles every 8 years. Now, if that kept on going till 2070, 45 years from now, what that would mean is by 2070, the average Brit and Yank would be twice as well off as today, and the average Chinese would be 60 times better off. This is what we're losing by believing conventional economic theory. Now, when I first visited China back in 81-82, it was a largely agricultural nation with extremely old-fashioned industry. This is a photo I took on the streets of Sichuan in 1981-82. And there's actually an alligator skin for sale back there. I think that's it there. A very agricultural society, and the machinery we saw in factories is extremely primitive. That's not the case anymore. It's a high-tech industrial powerhouse. The lives of Chinese as well as the landscapers. This is Shanghai, which I visited in 1981-82. On the other side, you have pretty basic industries and lots of rice paddies. This is Shanghai in 2024. It's a remarkable transformation. So China's got the divide between public and private spending right. The public sector builds the infrastructure and the socially beneficial facilities like universities and schools and so on, hospitals, that the private sector won't do on the scale that's necessary. And the reason is simple. It takes too long for the private sector to get the return it needs to make a profit over the cost of borrowing money or the cost of paying dividends to shareholders. But the private sector in China is extremely competitive in industries where rapid innovation matters. And if you want to see a good explanation of what's the right way to make the divide between what the private sector should spend money on, this book by Avner Offer, I highly recommend. Understanding the Private-Public Divide, Markets, Governments and Time Horizons. And that's part of the thinking that's also left out of mainstream economic theory. So we need to get rid of this delusional economic analysis. We need alternative methods to do economic analysis and to model the economy. And my Ravel software is one potential system for that. This is showing that a system without a government can have a debt deflation. This is mathematicians analysing it and saying, in the absence of government intervention, my model admits the possibility of an infinite level of private debt to GDP and collapsing wages and unemployment. But if you add a government sector to it, it doesn't reach equilibrium, but it prevents you falling into a debt deflation. So this is a positive argument for the role of government as a stabiliser of an unstable system. So you need the right economic tools and the right economic advisors to do the right thing politically, and that is not mainstream economists. They actually believe they're making the world a better place. They're quite sincere in what they argue, but look at what they argue. Here's the IMF saying that it'd be good for Italy to run a surplus of 3% of GDP. That is saying it's good for Italy to destroy something like 3% of its money supply every year. That would cause a catastrophe. Any politician who follows that advice will be undermined because their policies will fail. So politicians, whether they're left or right, they need a better, realistic approach to economics. So you can't manage the economy well using the same intellectual framework and the same tools that have given us austerity and decades of stagnation. So for economic realism rather than fantasy, we've got to throw neoclassical economic textbooks away and replace them with people like myself, anti-neoclassical, post-Keynesian economists who desperately want to help get out of the trap we're in now. We need new tools and new theories, and they already exist. My Ravel software enables the modelling of the economy as a dynamic monetary system. This is a quite elaborate model of the American economy, which is now out-predicting any neoclassical model. This is the work of a company called Applied MMT, based on my approach to economics using my Ravel software. If you want to take a look at this software, you can download a copy from patreon.com/Ravelation. Now, if you want more on my approach to economics, then follow and support me on Patreon or Substack. Those are the links for Patreon and Substack. And see my latest book, which is called Money and Macroeconomics from First Principles for Elon Musk and Other Engineers. Its argument basically talks like an engineer to Elon Musk and says, leave the economy alone, restrict yourself to blowing up rockets. And it's available in paperback and Kindle on Amazon. And if you don't want to pay any money to Amazon, then you can get it as a PDF on my Patreon website. So if you want to learn more than that again, I'm giving an online course now called the Ravel Economist Challenge, and the marketing links for that are here. That one takes you through a fairly lengthy marketing. This short circuits a bit of the marketing to get there in more rapidly. But please, share these ideas around. We need this knowledge to be widely known, and I don't care whether it's your friends or your enemies that know it. We simply have to get away from believing a series of myths about the economy that have led to the crisis situation which we've lived in permanently for the last 30 years. We need a new approach to economics. It exists. Come and join me, and I'll teach it to you.
Like many other truth seekers, I want to learn 50 years of real economics from me in only 7 weeks. You'll love my new 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge as well. To apply, go to stevekeen.com. If you qualify, you can attend my lectures, ask me questions personally every week, and make friends with a great group of like-minded people. So again, like many others, go to stevekeen.com to apply as well for the 7-week Rebel Economist Challenge. Good luck.